everybody's here, it looks like, and everybody's, well, you guys are also in order. I just really appreciate all you out there in the lobby, you know, our lobbyists. Just send money. Okay. Welcome to House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. On today's date, March 11th. First order of business is approved minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes? Representative Gartner, seconded by Representative Schreiber. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, same sign. None. Minutes passed. Okay, we'll move right along here. We're going to go into a virtual presentation by AECOM for question and answers from February 11th. Are they online?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Karen Massey. We have our teammates on with us again today that we had with the last presentation. I'll let them introduce themselves briefly, and we are happy to answer any questions you all may have regarding the presentation we made last month. Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all for having us again today. This is Bill Haas. I'm an Associate Vice President at AECOM, responsible for strategy and growth around all things electrification.
And Ezra.
I'm Ezra Bateman, Managing Director of Energea, and we were a subcontractor to AECOM, and we looked after a lot of the distributed energy resource analysis, fuels analysis, and cost of service and rate analysis.
And thank you. Does anyone have any questions regarding the presentation that we made?
Are there any questions? Senator Gartner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been so long ago, I don't remember the presentation exactly, but under item number 4, can you expand a little bit on, you know, part of that segment is EVs, electric vehicles, and what is your take? I mean, what do you see is the real problem of expansion rooted in infrastructure for EVs? Is that part of the problem that you see? Thank you.
Well, Ezra, you can follow on my comments, but I think the first point around electric vehicles is we characterized the market in Kansas. And while electric vehicles are seeing increased utilization and are expected to see significant increased utilization over time, the market in Kansas will lag behind other states, particularly states like New York and California. As a result, the impetus to install charging infrastructure is needed in Kansas, but it is not needed as quickly. So it's taking a more long-term view. We still feel that electric vehicles can, and the associated charging infrastructure are needed in the state and can provide a value to utilities who are either sponsoring, owning, or otherwise installing / promoting that infrastructure. Ezra?
Thanks, Bill. I think you were asking about what the barriers to EV adoption were, and I think there were 2 that we highlighted in the report. One was just the way that rates are currently designed, that based on our analysis of the actual cost to serve of electric vehicles, they may not be charging them purely on a cost causation basis. And a rate design that's more tailored to the cost of service of electric vehicles would reduce the cost of charging vehicles on the grid. And that would therefore encourage more adoption of these vehicles on the grid. And importantly, it would encourage the right kind of charging on the grid. Electric vehicles have a lot of flexibility in when they charge, and they can be a beautiful complement to renewable energy, including wind. But you have to send the right rate designs, price signals to them. So that was a point we made in the report. But as Bill said, the importance of infrastructure shouldn't be underestimated. You know, range anxiety is a big issue. People want to be able to use their vehicle to drive anywhere they can in a gasoline vehicle. And that, you know, basically means you're going to have a charging station every couple of 100 miles so people don't run out of charge, and it has to be relatively convenient. And that's just to get around the state or go interstate. Those that live in areas where they don't have their own parking space, you know, more urban areas, you've got other challenges and barriers. And the thing is, if these barriers aren't removed, it's going to really limit the size of the market. And right now, that's not such a big deal because you got to pay a premium to access an electric vehicle in many cases. But as those vehicles cost premiums fall, it will increasingly be seen as a social issue, not being able to charge and access these lower cost transportation options. So it's really important, in summary, that there is a network that allows you to go everywhere, and that there are also options for folks who aren't able to install them in their own homes. And that's going to be pressing in the next 4 to 5 years, which is when we expect the cost premiums to change significantly as production ramps up. Thank you.
You.
Any other questions? Representative Keither?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that question, the 4 to 5 years down the road, is there any chance that there will be anything done on the national level? I mean, I'm thinking we have I-70 going right through the heart of the state, and being able to charge along major highways in the United States certainly is going to be something that's going to have to happen. So is there any conversation going on with that? Thank you.
So it's a bit of reading tea leaves. There are discussions at the federal level of a massive charging network associated with the interstate system and tying that to climate goals. But at the same time, and this is a sort of personal professional perspective, I'm one to feel that states need and should take action and should control what they can control and not leave things to the feds. So I guess I wouldn't wait for the federal government to solve this potential problem. I think it's something that states need to get behind, and I think states need to get behind it from the areas that they can and where they have the ability to make policy, particularly tying back to what Ezra just said around rate making. If you see the rates that can encourage EV adoption while also capturing the benefits that electric vehicles provide, and not just the environmental benefits. I'm looking at the actual economic benefits for all ratepayers. That's where you really see the value. And that's the value that states should move forward with in enacting policy and in developing new rate structures.
And we've also seen that certain states have passed legislation looking at studies to what to do around certain highways as well as federal interstates. For example, Florida last year passed a bill that directed a study looking at the EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure along their evacuation routes. As you can understand, that's very important, looking at range. So we have seen some states are looking at things of that nature, kind of looking both at the federal highways as well as their own highways that connect in there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome. Any other questions? Representative Gardner.
Mr. Chairman, very quickly, and Representative Kessler and Turner sit on tax with me, and we do have a bill in front of us that was filed for a tax credit for a company to come in and install, what was it, 350, was that close, fast charging stations throughout Kansas. Oklahoma, other states are already progressing down that road, so to speak. So it's something we're looking at, and hopefully we can, as the speaker said, I'm not sure we want to wait on the feds. There might be money in this stimulus package. There might be an infrastructure package coming down the road that might help us, but I'm not sure we want to wait for them. But anyway, just a comment, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Mr. Turner? Okay. Just for the committee, you might explain who you are, ACOM, and where you're located, and are you a consulting group or whatever? Would you mind doing that for everybody, just in case there's any questions on that?
Happy to do so. So ACOM is a global energy or engineering, architecture, and design firm. We have about 40,000 employees and 160 locations globally. We work in transportation, in energy, buildings and places, environmental work, water work, and design and construction work. Myself and my colleague Karen are in our energy practice, where we focus on utility rate design, utility incentive programs, utility and energy infrastructure, everything from transmission and distribution to construction to project management. And we have a significant focus in the past couple of years around electrification, getting to the earlier comments around electric vehicles and vehicle charging. And myself, I am physically located in Chicago, and my colleague Karen is physically located near Jefferson City, Missouri. Also, we have a subcontractor that participated in our work. Ezra, do you want to introduce Energea and your firm?
Thank you, Bill. Energea is an electricity mainly focused consultancy. We do a lot of work with distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, solar storage, infrastructure planning, and we're based in Davis, California, and Sydney, Australia.
Okay. Any other questions for the? Okay, I got a quick question talking about the advanced energy solutions on that item 4 myself. As we tend to move toward a lot more electric vehicles and a lot more on the grid with wind and solar panel and cutting back on the fossil fuels and the nuclear energy, we had a strange event that happened, and a lot of people were without electricity for a number of years. Never seen that happen. But if we continue to grow the grid and put more cars on charging stations every night, and we do have a problem, is there any kind of protection for the people that are willing to pay for the fossil fuel generation guarantee that they have it? And then my thinking is, and I had several constituents ask me, if we put all these electric cars on the grid at night and we're starting to charge a lot of electricity on them, and then we have another event, are we going to be able to shut them down? Because that's probably not as essential as having heat in your home as it is charging your car. I mean, is that something we're looking at too? Because once we get so much of a drain on that, you know, how do we keep up with the base load of generation? Could anybody answer that? Or
yeah, so my perspective is that, you know, we currently have our demand curves. You can look at them by utility, by state, aggregate them up by the transmission system, the markets that you're in. And careful planning and rate design can actually use these new technologies, particularly understanding where new load growth is going to be. And then that gets back to what I keep harping on, which is effective rate design, so that you can shift demand and actually make your system more efficient as these new assets come online. Really, if properly managed, the difference between renewables, distributed energy resources, and fossil generation is the same. You just need to know what the capabilities of those generation assets are, when they produce power, and where that power is utilized. So in terms of a turning off and switching back to fossil, that's not really, in my opinion, a need. What the need is effective rate design and effective load management as you have new loads coming on, and being able to really effectively utilize those loads, particularly as you mentioned, vehicles charging at night. That's actually an asset. There's overcapacity. This is a generalization, but there's overcapacity in your evening hours and your late night hours where, heating loads or cooling loads aren't really a factor at night. So it's a perfect application of charging vehicles. But the need, again, is on effective rate design and effective load management so that you can utilize those demands as opposed to just meet those demands. Ezra?
Well, my question more centered around not the general everyday run-of-the-mill type. It's an emergency situation. And I understand charging at night's not a big deal. It kind of keeps hope in the load. I'm saying an emergency situation that we experienced this year in several states where people were without electricity because they couldn't have enough base load generation to make up for all the renewable generation. And I was at a meeting, I'm on the Energy Council also, and we talked about in California that using electric or EVs to charge up at night, and that way during the daytime, and they would keep the system up at night. I got all that. I'm just saying in an emergency situation like we just experienced, is there any kind of a plan for that?
So my recommendation, focusing in on that, would be boiled down to one word, which is resiliency. Utilities need to be planning for those events. They need to be looking at their assets, whether they're fossil generated or distributed energy resources, and building resilience into the system. It's my opinion that we are going to see more events like this. They're not going to happen every year per se, but they are going to happen. And the system needs to be resilient enough and have the backup capabilities to provide that energy that's needed. Because I think, as you're alluding to, there are health and safety concerns that come along with being able to provide power to the people who need it. And the system needs to be able to provide power in extreme weather events, or if part of the system is impacted by forest fire, or even looking at a localized level where there's a impact of a tornado event or something along those lines. And there are technologies available. They've been available for a long time. It's not necessarily high tech to build that resiliency into the system and to make sure that all generating assets, whether they're distributed energy resources, whether they're renewable resources, whether they're fossil-based resources, can provide the power to who it needs to have the power, and that the power primarily can get there. And that's a planning exercise that I think needs to happen. It needs to happen at the state regulatory level. It needs to happen within bodies like yourselves. And I think given the recent events, there's an impetus on doing it and doing it quickly to identify those pressure points within the system, the areas where there's potential for failure, and being able to build resilience into the system. And then as you start having those conversations, then you can start having the decisions around and discussions around whether or not to, deploy newer technologies, deploy microgrids, deploy storage, and other types of technologies like the electric vehicles and vehicle to grid, and using those vehicles as assets during those critical times.
Gardner.
I hate to keep asking questions, Mr. Chairman. A good point. I guess I would, first of all, just a comment. Being resilient is fantastic, but then you have to equate the cost because to build in that into the network, there's going to be a significant amount of cost. But now getting my question, to do that, would it not be would it be to do that would be part of a state energy plan? Question.
That's a good question. Yes, I think that a state energy plan, and Karen and myself have worked on and delivered state energy plans for Missouri and for Iowa and some other jurisdictions and states. I think it's a critical part of any state energy plan because I believe that resilience is a critical component of any forward-looking planning and policy making that a state would entail. Granted, and you have the ability to focus the topic areas of any state energy planning, but I would personally suggest that resilience be a critical component of that. And I think that if you're going through the process and looking towards a comprehensive state energy plan, that would give you the ability to really look at, as you mentioned, the costs and the benefits, and to look at those costs and the benefits from the cost to ratepayers versus infrastructure, the costs and benefits of protecting yourself from extreme weather events or other grid issues or deficiencies, and also looking at the economic development components of those as well. So you really do get a full picture of making grid investments in anticipation of grid failure.
Thank you. Good question, Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure who would want to respond to this, but I was wondering on page 103, you have a chart there about transmission costs related to location marginal pricing, and they diverge, and you talk a little bit about it in the text, but I was wondering if you could kind of go through that and explain those two lines there.
As we pulled it up, just to state it again, it was page 103.
Yes, figure 50.
So Ezra, do you want to talk a little bit about the LMP and what that represents to start?
Sure. So one of the areas of analysis that we did was to look at the change in the locational marginal prices across the state over time. And we looked at them, of course, really in relation to fuel, but that was in a different section. In this section, we're really comparing the amount spent on transmission infrastructure as the market was expanded and it was reinforced, allowing for more trade and energy flows across the region. And so what you can see there is what appears to be a correlation of, as you had more regionalization, prices falling. But that, started to bottom out over time, but you also saw the amount of investment in transmission also, or at least the cost charged, flattening out over time as well.
And it appears that the slope on the investment is less than the slope on the decrease in the location marginal pricing. So it seems like the addition of that, the more transmission, that it seemed to drop those prices a little bit more than for each dollar invested in the transmission. Is that, am I looking at that correctly?
I believe that's the case. I think one of the key findings, so first of all, we found that there would seem to be benefits to whoever was buying power from these transmission investments. I guess the caution is moving forward, if there's just to make sure that the potential benefits continue to be there for increasing the level of transmission investment. Because you saw a great drop there from 13 to 15.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on. I'm sure there's a lot of questions about that, but let's continue with your presentation, please.
So I think we've completed our formal presentations. I think we got them covered in the last meeting.
Okay,
So
that'll work. If anybody has any questions then? Seeing none, thank you for coming, or I don't know how you say that on here. Thank you for videoing with us, so we appreciate your deal.
thank you so much for the invitation. We've really enjoyed working on this project.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next up is a update with the electric utility response to extreme cold weather event with Chuck Casey, CEO of Evergy. Welcome, Chuck. State your name, would you please?
Chuck Casely, and thank you for that promotion. I hope my boss isn't listening. If he is, then now he knows he's out of a job.
Well, we was talking about your salary earlier, so.
Which, Mr. Chair, I think maybe you had slightly overstated. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Keither, members of the committee, Chuck Casely with Evergy. Happy to be back here today and appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to make a short presentation and talk about the events around the winter storm, which I think now has been named Uri by somebody, and the extreme cold weather. I know there were temporary emergency power outages that some of you may have experienced, and I bet you have constituents that have questions and now questions about the impact on bills and things like that. So I'm going to walk through the event, kind of what we did and how we responded to it, the timeline of events, but then I would be open to any questions that members of the committee have. I'd probably be a little remiss if I didn't start, though, and that question of resilience, I think, was an important one. But Representative Gartner, you are right on point. And I just remind folks, when you're talking about investing in resiliency, which is redundancy and a whole bunch of additions to the grid, yeah, a lot of that technology exists, but it would cost billions of dollars to implement some of those things. For example, transmission, which sometimes gets criticized, does lower market prices and does increase resiliency, but billions of dollars alone can be spent just on transmission. Distributed generation, yes, it could probably help in a situation like that, except that we don't own it. And 99% of it is not configured currently by the owners to be able to put energy back onto the grid or even run when we're not supplying it electricity to convert the energy from DC to AC. And then I would just point out that, things like electric vehicles, they have the theoretical capability to put electricity back on the grid. But again, most are not configured to do so by their owners at this point, or even the manufacturers. And so to put that in perspective, to chase absolute resiliency and put billions and billions of dollars into the grid to do that, for right now, an event that's happened one time in the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's just a big expense. And again, from a policy consideration, something that everybody should have a voice in and everybody should think through very carefully. So wanted to talk about the chain of events that led us to this series of actions that we took that have been the conversation of the last month or so. So starting as early as the 6th, 7th, or 8th, or the week before we initiated temporary emergency power outages on the 15th and 16th of February, Evergy started to get ready for what we knew was going to be a rough stretch. Nobody in the country knew just how bad it would end up being, but we did have warning from weather forecasts. We did have communication with the Southwest Power Pool, and we did start to prepare. I think everybody in this committee is probably very aware of what the Southwest Power Pool is, but it is essentially a 17-state region that runs from the border with Canada all the way down to the panhandle of Texas. And when we think about that, it's tied together into one large electrical grid. And there are many policy reasons for that. Some of it is resiliency. The larger a grid, the more difficult it is to destabilize it. If you think of a grid as something balanced, you know, like this portfolio balanced on a pencil. When you use power, that pushes down, and we push back by generating power. And you keep this thing balanced over time. Now, if I were to drop my coffee on this, what would happen? It would destabilize. But imagine that you have a bigger grid like this table, and it's got a pedestal, and it's balanced on it, and I drop this coffee on it. What happens? Nothing. It's big enough to take that imbalance. And so in general, larger grids are more stable. And in general, what happens with the Southwest Power Pool is it's over such a big geographic region that if there's a problem in one spot, other areas can help it out by diverting power down there. The problem that occurred with this event is all 17 of those states were experiencing the same storm and the same weather over the same time period. And that just frankly doesn't happen very often. And it's never happened to this degree in the wintertime. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. So the week before the event, we started to get ready for this. What did we do? Well, we started to increase the number of people we had on shifts. We stopped all proactive maintenance. Representative Schreiber, if he was here, can tell you that as we start to get into the middle and later parts of February and then into March and April, Representative Turner could probably tell you the same thing. We start to take our bigger coal units and take them out of rotation and start getting them ready for hot summer weather. So they're ready to run when it's 95, 100 degrees. We did not do that. Anything proactive that was going on a week before, we stopped simply to have them ready and running for the weather that we were expecting. We also started weatherizing any of our moving equipment to handle the extreme cold weather. Just about everything that runs, when you start getting into the -10, -20, we actually got up to -28 degrees at one of our power plants in the morning, in Tuesday the 16th in the morning, they start to have issues. So we started weatherizing equipment that had diesel engines. We started doing all that kind of preventative stuff. We staffed up our call centers, and we started having multiple daily conversations with the Southwest Power Pool. So we were in a frenzy of activity prior to the weekend before when these outages actually occurred. On Friday and on Saturday, the Southwest Power Pool did a couple of things. One, they took all of our available plants, anything that we had up and running, and committed them for a multi-day time period. This would be a 4-day time period. Now, normally, the way the SPP works, or the Southwest Power Pool works, is by committing plants a day ahead of time. They took the unprecedented action, and again, we can't remember the last time they did this, of not committing those plants 1 day ahead, but committing those plants 4 days ahead. And so that set off a flurry of activity too. Some of those plants are peaker plants. They only run for short periods of time, generally in the summertime, between 3 and 7 o'clock at night, when you have typically the highest demand for electricity. So they're not long-term base load plants that are always on. They're designed to run for short periods of time. But if they're going to run for 4 days, then we had to go out and make sure that we could get the diesel fuel oil as well as natural gas to run these plants. So that started a flurry of activity. And then we also started talking to the railroads that service us, principally Kansas City Southern and BNSF, to make sure that as this weather came in, we had an expectation of what their coal deliveries might look like and how it might be impacted. So that's Friday and Saturday. Then on Sunday the 14th, we went to 24/7 staffing at all our facilities, and particularly power plants. All of those were beefed up to really large crews that came in. We switched to all of our cold weather procedures at all of our facilities. And on Sunday, Sunday afternoon, we put out a press release and asked customers to start conserving. That was initiated right around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was at the request of the Southwest Power Pool. Now, it's important to know that at that point, we knew that it was going to be rough over the next 48 hours. But at this point, nobody knew for sure and weren't really expecting to have to call temporary emergency power outages. We weren't there yet. And the way to think about this, probably the best analogy I've heard somebody come up with is think about this as a weather forecast. You know, you get a weather forecast that's 4, 5, 6 days away. you start to prepare for it. If it's going to be a little warmer, it's going to be a little colder, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Then as you get closer, they might say, well, we expect storms or we expect rain on this particular day, and it gets a little more tight. Well, then you get to the actual days and you find out now you've got the conditions that are present for a tornado. And so what do? They call a tornado watch. Not saying it's going to happen, but they're telling you be prepared, it could happen. And then what's the final progression of that? It's a tornado warning. And if you hear the sirens go off and there's a tornado warning, what do you have to do? You immediately seek shelter. There's no time to wait. Well, that's exactly what this kind of a thing is. So by Sunday night, I would say we were in a stage of a tornado watch. We knew it was possible, but how many times do you have a tornado watch called and there's actually no tornado? It's just the conditions are present that it could happen. So then we get to Monday morning. And before I get to Monday morning, I just want to reiterate, we did not have blackouts. Now, I don't fault my friends in the media who are trying to sell newspapers and ads on TV for calling them blackouts. But the definition of a blackout is an uncontrolled outage caused by grid equipment failure. We did not have grid equipment failure. And for the times where we did call temporary emergency power outages, and again, we'll get into those here shortly, we actually had enough generation to meet our customers' load needs. We could meet their demand. So it was not caused by a shortage of generation either. What we did was at the direction of the Southwest Power Pool, and it was to prevent what we saw elsewhere, principally Texas, which were blackouts, rolling blackouts where demand far exceeded the generation that they had available. It burned up equipment, it caused all sorts of problems, and then they had millions of people out for multiple days. That's what the Southwest Power Pool and all of its member utilities were trying to avoid. So we get to Monday morning, and things really escalate quite quickly. There are operating conditions for the Southwest Power Pool, and they're called emergency or energy emergency alerts, or EEAs. And as of 5 a.m. on Monday morning, they declared an EEA level 1. Now, what that meant for us was we immediately started talking to customers with load that they could reduce. Typically, these are big industrial customers, and preparing them that if we went to an EEA 2, we would ask them to reduce their load. So that's kind of the first step past general conservation for us. Well, things very rapidly escalated on Monday. By 7:22 a.m., SPP went into an EEA 2, and we had to call those customers up and ask them to start reducing their usage. Now, they're prepared for that. They know that this is going on, but I also want you to put you in the position of some of these big companies. They're experiencing this negative 20-degree weather too. And so if you are making things and you have materials flowing through pipes and you've got extreme cold, think about the damage that could result to some of those customers by reducing their load. So we worked hand in glove with those customers to see if they could reduce as much load as possible without rendering damage to their equipment. They did this state a great service, and so I want to mention some of the biggest contributors here just briefly. Occidental Petroleum, Goodyear, Bradkin, Holly Frontier, Ford Motor Company. Those are probably the biggest, but they on Monday and on Tuesday and a few on Wednesday actually reduced their loads and put their own equipment at risk in order to help out in this situation. As I mentioned, it very rapidly escalated on Monday. So at 5, they were at EEA 1, 7:22, we went to EEA 2, and then at 10:08, Southwest Power Pool called an Energy Emergency Alert Level 3, and as soon as they do that, you are on notice that they could call for a load reduction or for us to reduce load ourselves. And sure enough, that happened at 12:10 p.m. on the 15th. We had the directive to reduce our load in our service territory. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about that. We're a member of this organization. When they send out that alert, we do not have a choice. They will give us, on that particular day, I think they reduced, the Southwest Power Pool asked about 600 megawatts, 613 megawatts be reduced across the entire 14-state region. There's 3 states that are part of the Western Interconnect, so for purposes of today, they weren't really affected by this. It was the 14 states in the middle of the country. Every utility got part of that 613 megawatts that had to be reduced, and we did too. So at 12:10, we get the word, and around 12:15 is when we started temporary emergency power outages. We targeted them to last between 30 and 60 minutes, given the information that we knew. And then by about 1:20, we were told by the Southwest Power Pool we could stop that. And then by 2 p.m., just that quickly, SPP went back to an EEA2. So that was Monday. We continued to communicate with customers throughout the day with respect to the fact that we were still in a heightened alert state, that it could still happen again, most likely overnight or in the morning the next day. But for the rest of the day, Monday, we were out of the woods. On Tuesday, the 16th, at 6:15 a.m., we were told by the Southwest Power Pool they were going back to EEA3. And then at 7 o'clock, we began temporary emergency power outages at their request. Now this time, the event size was significantly bigger, in the vicinity of about 2,700 megawatts. So better than 4 times the amount of electricity that needed to be reduced across the entire Southwest Power Pool. And they were telling us that it was going to happen for a lot longer than they originally anticipated. I know this because I just happened to be in the middle of a press conference telling people if we had outages that it would be around 30 to 60 minutes. Literally, as I was telling people that was the situation we were anticipating, Southwest Power Pool was saying it was going to be more and it was going to be longer. And we'll come back and talk about what all the causes for these are, but that's what was going on. So on Tuesday, the 16th, it ended up being some customers were actually put out of power for 2 to 3 hours from a temporary emergency power outage, because we held that initial group a little longer than we originally anticipated, because we didn't know how deep and how long this was going to go. What ended up happening when you hold folks in that extreme weather out for 2 or 3 hours, you always have some circuits that when you turn them back on, they have a malfunction or something goes wrong. And so we called approximately 450 circuits on the 16th, and of the 450 to 460, and of those circuits, right around 40 to 50, trying to find the exact number here, did not respond when we turned it back on, which means then we have to run a crew out, figure out what's going on, and fix that part of the system. So there are some customers on the 16th that could have been out 4 or 5, even several that were out 6 hours as a result of those outages. In all, on the 15th, 63,000 customers experienced an outage, and then on the 16th, 276,000 experienced an outage. All in, we're at about 327 unique customers that experienced an outage over Monday or Tuesday, and that's just under 20% of our entire customer base, just to give you a idea of what we're talking about. Again, the power outages ended on about 10:30 on Tuesday. We continued to communicate with customers throughout the day. Social media, we actually did a press release on Tuesday night saying the SPP is reporting we could have outages a third day. We did not end up having outages on a third day. We razor thin margins, the Southwest Power Pool got through on Wednesday. And then by the end of the week, we were back down just into conservative or more normal operations. So there's a lot of things that contributed to this event, but I want to talk through several of the major factors. First of all, I think it's natural when anytime you have somebody outside of your state impacting your state, a natural question to ask is, well, wait a minute. Well, if you guys had enough electricity, and this was caused by the Southwest Power Pool directing you to do this, well, maybe we don't need the Southwest Power Pool. What I would point out is there are a lot of advantages to the Southwest Power Pool. The first is that it's a lot more stable across a 14-state region than it would be otherwise if it was just Evergy's grid. The second is because it's a 14-state region, we all sell our electricity into that grid, and the cheapest plants on any given day are the ones that are run, which means we're by definition getting the cheapest power in a 17-state region that's serving you, where if it was just Evergy, you'd have our cheapest plants versus 14 to 17 states worth of cheapest plants. So there's a lot, and that's unlocked, as Representative Schreiber was talking about earlier, that's unlocked by transmission. And so that's another advantage. A third advantage, and something that didn't end up being an advantage in this situation, is that usually 9.9 times out of 10, if there's a forest fire in South Dakota, or if there's an extreme weather condition in Oklahoma, it's not impacting the rest of the Southwest Power Pool, and we can move power to that area. So there are many times in the summertime and others where it's very advantageous. This just happened to be a gigantic weather system that brought us bitterly cold weather over the entire Midwest of the country for 4 or 5 days. So one of the things that was an issue here was access to fuel. And I want to talk about that briefly. Firstly, and most importantly, natural gas. We don't have this in the summertime. When it gets really hot in the summertime, do you know what people aren't doing? They're not using natural gas to heat their homes. And so the only people that are consuming natural gas in a hot temperature situation are power plants and industrial consumers. Conversely, in the wintertime, power plants are competing with homes in terms of being able to access natural gas. And that's what we had here. It was very difficult to get firm delivery of natural gas to run all of the natural gas power plants in the Southwest Power Pool. And the gas that could be gotten was extremely expensive. So that's the first thing that happened. Secondly, coal. Coal's not immune to weather, and we have precipitation and freezing. So coal that's normally like sand, it's pulverized coal that comes in and sits out in a big pile in our power plant yards, became like concrete during this time period. We literally had to use jackhammers and had to use giant bulldozers to break this stuff up. Now, the good news is we could, right? We did get it broken up. We did keep those plants on, but it's much more difficult to store. It's much more difficult to get it there. And so fuel was a problem for coal as well. And so if you have all of these power plants that are of trouble keeping the fuel necessary to run, that was one of the big problems of this event. The second was the lack of the ability to import electricity. Right next to the Southwest Power Pool is an organization just like SPP called MISO, and on any given day, MISO and Southwest Power Pool exchange electricity back and forth across their borders, whoever needs help. Again, they weren't quite as cold as the middle of the country is. This is, think of the eastern side of Missouri and then going east into, Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and some of those middle and northeastern states. They didn't have excess capacity to sell us. So despite having robust interconnection with MISO, the importation of electricity and the ability to do that was just not available because they were super cold as well. In addition, transmission had a lot of constraints. Now, again, this is a very educated committee and you know a lot about transmission, but the way I explain this to other committees and other folks not as educated is transmission is just like an interstate highway, right? Interstate highways conduct massive amount of cars between point A and point B, and there's very limited places where you get on and you get off. There's super highways, right? Well, transmission is the exact same thing. The problem is in this event, if you had a bunch of natural gas, and this is one of the things that happened, a bunch of natural gas plants go down in Oklahoma because they could not get access to enough fuel to run, all of a sudden we're sending tons of cars down that interstate to Oklahoma, and you reach a capacity. You can't send any more cars down. And so transmission constraints, rush hour on the transmission system was another thing that was difficult in this event. And then finally, there's been a lot of conversation about the fact what generation wasn't available? Well, all generation had problems. I've talked about natural gas. We did manage to keep our coal plants out. None of the coal plants that were available to run for this event ever went completely down. We had one that stopped making quite as much electricity, made a little less electricity on Tuesday and Wednesday because they were having trouble getting access to coal, but all of them stayed on during this event. But the other final thing is, other places were not as lucky. And so there were literally, thousands of megawatts in other states that did not have enough electricity to meet their load. And part of that is also wind. For us, about 50% of our installed, what we would expect normally at that time of year is what we were getting. For a combination of icing and a combination of the wind speeds were just 8 to 10 miles an hour, and that just isn't enough to turn the turbines and make electricity. So it's really all of those things. It was access to fuel, lack of an ability to import from other areas, transmission constraints, generation unavailability, and then you couple all that together with the highest amount of electricity consumption in the winter that the SPP has ever seen. They've set a new peak of 45 gigawatts, and of which, just to give you some size and scale, Evergy all in is about 8 to 9 gigawatts of that 45 gigawatts. All of those factors together contributed to the situation that we experienced on the 15th and 16th. Just a couple of other things to talk about. These are really just questions that people always ask, so I thought I'd address them up front and then open it up for any questions you may have. The first is, I am sure you have heard from constituents that customers had a difficult time for several hours on both days, Monday and Tuesday, getting a hold of and interacting with us. This is the truth. This is the absolute truth. We had some systems failures on our phone system and on our website, predominantly caused by the fact that we've never seen that much traffic and that many people trying to access it at the same time. To give you an idea, for our internet, our website, where you can report an outage or just look at an outage map and see what's going on, we had 6 times the peak load or the peak number of people trying to access that website that we've ever seen since we've had a website. And the machine stopped having the ability to count at that point. So it was probably higher, but that caused a failure. We brought on additional capacity overnight. The next morning, on Tuesday, we took all the functionality of the website and stripped it down just to outage reporting and just to the ability to see what was going on from an outage perspective and get information. And that's when we had an internet outage. Our internet supplier, the person who runs, the entity that runs our network, ironically out of Dallas, had multiple points of failure from Dallas to our area, but then also a temporary power outage of ours actually impacted service to our internet providers and our data centers. So it went down despite everything we did a second day. As soon as that happens, people get on the phone and call us. And if you have several 100,000 people trying to call you at the same time, it's almost impossible to get through there too. So there are some lessons learned. We apologize for this. We know, and have apologized to customers, we know that was a suboptimal experience. There are lots of lessons learned. We are in the process of working through all of the different contingencies that we need to put in place, and there's lots of learnings. But if you're asked by consumers and told that they had a hard time reaching us for a couple hour periods on both days, that's true, and we need to get better. Another question that we get all the time is, how are outages determined? And I do think in the environment that we kind of live in today, there's a big question of, well, do you sit around with a map and say, well, we're going to call that area and that area and that area and kind of pick where it is? And the answer is no. Prior to these events, we're required by law to have a list of circuits we can call in order to meet the amount of demand that we need to reduce. It's a list that sits on the shelf. And it's not identified back to certain neighborhoods. It doesn't have any of that information with it. What it has is just circuit numbers, number of customers, and the amount of load that it would reduce if we called it. It's like a big game of Tetris. You're trying to find just the right pieces to fit in to get what you need to reduce and not any more. Adding to that, given the situation, we also went through and we tried to make sure that all the hospitals that we could identify, that those circuits weren't called. We had gone through earlier in the year and talked to health systems to see where they were storing the COVID vaccine. Many of these things need to be stored at extremely cold temperatures. And so we wanted to make sure we weren't impacting that supply to the region. And then we also tried to make sure that other critical facilities, mostly pumping stations on transmission pipelines for natural gas and propane, weren't impacted. That took out a lot of circuits. We could avoid most of those circuits. If this had gone on longer, we might have had to call on some of those circuits, notwithstanding the fact that we tried to take them out. So this is a system where we literally build to how much load we need to reduce, try and take out the critical infrastructure that would be really negatively impacting the area, and then move on from there. And then the third thing is we've heard a lot of comparisons between the Southwest Power Pool and what's going on in Texas. And so I thought I'd just address that for a minute and then be happy to take your questions. It is very true that Texas and Kansas are very different in the way that the electrical grid is run and the way consumers interact with electric companies. But there are some key similarities, and I thought I'd start with the similarities. First of all, they're giant systems. The Southwest Power Pool goes over a 17-state region, right? And Texas is only a 1-state region, and not even the entire state of Texas, most of it, 90% of it. But in terms of size, Texas is actually bigger. So when we talked about having a big grid makes you a little more reliable, well, the peak that Texas experienced in this in the event, and they had rolling blackouts for days for millions of customers, was 69 gigawatts as compared to our 45 gigawatts in the Southwest Power Pool. So even just being one state, they're still 50% bigger than the Southwest Power Pool combined, all 17 of those states. And they still have to balance the grid. And what happened in Texas is they didn't get emergency reductions called quickly enough, and load, demand for electricity and generation didn't match, and it caused a really big mess. Fortunately, that did not happen in the Southwest Power Pool. We did have temporary emergency outages through 14 states, but we did not have any rolling blackouts or large, uncontrolled, huge population hits. There are also some key differences, though, between Texas and the Southwest Power Pool, and in particular Kansas, and these are all beneficial for Kansas. The first is Texas is a deregulated state, which means that the price they pay for the electricity oftentimes, many times, goes up and down with the price of making that electricity. And so when prices spiked because of natural demand and because supply contracted in Texas and got up to $1,500, $2,000 a megawatt, you don't have that impact here because their prices go up and are immediately reflected on bills as a deregulated state. Here, we can't change our rates unless we go to the Kansas Corporation Commission. It's a set rate. So we did experience increased costs, but those are going to be contemplated on future bills. And one of the things the KCC did, which was just phenomenal, is very early in this process, they came out and said, we understand this is an extraordinary event, and we're going to investigate all of the mechanisms around this. But for right now, what utilities, gas and electric in Kansas need to know is, we get it, you're spending money, keep the lights on, and we'll work with you to smooth those costs out over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. There'll be some utilities in some states that probably spread these costs out over 5 or 10 years, maybe even more. So the KCC was extremely responsive, extremely helpful, and I think aided in keeping the reliability of the state going. And I think it's part of the benefits of being a regulated state versus a deregulated state. Two other things to know about Texas. One, and the difference between us and Texas. The second thing is, because they're deregulated, the people who make the electricity and the people who deliver the electricity are different, which means when those blackouts started, there's a whole bunch of finger pointing going back and forth. And the people who deliver the electricity say, well, that's because there wasn't enough electricity on the grid. And the people who made the electricity said, well, there's enough electricity, but those folks delivering it messed it up. And that's not conducive to keeping reliability. Well, you don't have that here. If there's one throat to choke, and I'm it. Evergy's it. If something goes wrong, you know who to talk to. We can't point at somebody else and say, you know, they didn't deliver us enough electricity, so we couldn't do something. And then the third thing is the Southwest Power Pool, as I mentioned before, has strong ability to import through transmission lines from other regional transmission organizations like MISO. You really don't have that in Texas. So they have a limited ability to import power, and they do, but not nearly to the extent and not nearly with the ties that we have here. Again, all three of those things benefit Kansas being regulated, having a vertically integrated regulated utility to answer to policymakers and regulators, and then having a robust transmission system to bring power from elsewhere. So that's really the, that's what I had in terms of remarks. I'm sure there's a ton of questions, and Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any of them.
Thank you. Very good presentation. My Wichita friend, Representative Carmichael's had his hand up for quite a while. So Representative Carmichael, I'll let you go first.
Here, we'll try it that way. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I was anxious to ask a few questions. Mr. Casely, first, congratulations on your promotion.
Thanks, Representative.
I heard that and was very pleased. Second, I want to compliment Evergy on its management of this disaster and crisis. From my vantage point, we had a resilient system and one that, in my judgment, performed very well under extreme circumstances. And I appreciate my investor-owned utility being prepared for these types of events. And I also appreciate the meaningful and factual real-time briefings that you provided to the press. I tried to watch you in almost real time. My only complaint was when you superimposed your head on the background behind you, it put a halo over you, sort of like it does. They accuse me of the same thing.
Representative.
Now, all those good things being said, my constituents, as you may know, are a part of the old KG&E system, at one time known as the Southern Division of Western Resources. We suffered for many, many years under a differential rate structure between the Southern Division and the Northern Division, principally based upon an explanation that there was excess generating capacity at Wolf Creek and that those of us in the old KG&E territory had to pay for it while our friends up north did not. I now read in the press that apparently there was excess generating capacity in the northern part of your system and less inadequate generating capacity in the southern portion of your system. And so once again, me and my constituents are going to get the screws that we are going to pay more in surcharges. And so I wonder if you could explain to me how that works, where the dividing line is. I think Representative Schreiber in Emporia, maybe he's going to get a higher bill, whereas Representative Keither in Topeka may actually get a credit. Can you explain how that works and why we still have this disparity in rate structures between the old KG&E system and the KCP&L and the KP&L systems?
Absolutely, and Representative, I think those are excellent questions, and I think a lot of people would like to understand that. So I'm going to turn back to the chair. I think they'll adjust the cameras, but I'll answer your question. So first of all, the division between KG&E and KP&L, which were two, as Representative Carmichael said, the northern part and the southern part of the legacy Westar system. Several years back, Representative Schreiber would probably know the details around this. Those two jurisdictions were merged. So they now have one rate structure. There's no difference between the rates that are, base rates that are charged in Wichita or Topeka or Emporia or Lawrence. Where you do get into a different rate structure is when you get into Johnson County and the metropolitan area of Kansas City, There it is part of the old legacy KCP&L service territory. And together with, if you take the state line and you go, essentially 15 miles on either side and draw a big circle around it, that's what we kind of think of as the metropolitan area for Evergy. And so those are two different rate jurisdictions. And the reason, there's really a couple reasons that those rate jurisdictions haven't been merged. One is probably fairly obvious, which is it would be a lot, you're still going to have a division at the state line there. But the second is there's a rate differential, a normal rate differential between what we now call Kansas Central for Evergy, which is the old Westar service territory, and the metropolitan area for KCP&L or Evergy Metro. And that is that by and large, the rates, the base rates on a daily basis are less expensive in Kansas Central than they are in the metro area. And that does get back to the fact, Representative, that there are coal plants and excess capacity within that KCP&L system that are retrofit for modern environmental standards and that provide on that 2 or 3 days out of a 50-year time period for more generation. There's more generation there than they need at this time, but it was extremely beneficial during the time period that we just experienced. So Ranking Member Keither, Representative Schreiber, they're going to have the same rate and the same impact out of this that they, the north-south division for Kansas Central or Westar is gone. So it's the same impact to them. But if you want to complain, go talk to Speaker Reichman, because he's going to get less. He will be charged less. So, and again, that gets to the historic way that the service territories have historically been. And so what happens is, if you were to go in January 15th and say to the folks in Wichita, you know what, let's have the same rates in Wichita as we have in Olathe or in Overland Park. And to do that, maybe we'll move you guys up a penny a kilowatt hour, and we'll move down Olathe or Overland Park a penny. You'll have the same rates and the same assets and rate base. In Wichita would say about that in January. Well, now we've got the exact same situation, only it's the opposite. There was excess capacity that people are paying for in Overland Park and in Olathe and other parts of Johnson County that for 2 days was extremely beneficial because they supplied power to other people, and it is actually going to end up at the end of the day with a credit. What I would say is there's been a lot of public reporting to the SEC and then other public declarations made by utilities in the Southwest Power Pool, both gas and electric. And just to give you some perspective on how the two areas did relatively, if you take up, it's about 40 or 41 that have made public declarations, again, electric and gas. The best performing, and the range per customer estimated, these are all estimated numbers, right? But the impact from a cost perspective on a per customer basis ranged from a credit to customers that they could expect to get all the way up to the worst situation is right around $1,700 a customer across that 14-state region with about 40 utilities at this point, talking about what, the impacts of the storm. If you look at Evergy Metro, they're first. They're the only, it looks like at this point, it's going to be the only service territory in the Southwest Power Pool that ends up with a credit on their bills, again, probably over time, smoothed out over time. If you look at Evergy Central, again, that's the old Westar service territory, they came in seventh out of 40 or so utilities that have publicly reported at this point. So close to the top decile, definitely the top quartile of performance in the Southwest Power Pool, and again, electricity and natural gas. So even though it is a little bit more, the relative to performance to everybody else is pretty solid. And again, we're still working this out. We don't have all the settlements finally in from the Southwest Power Pool and other places, but that's the relative performance at this point.
Thank you for that very helpful answer, Mr. Chairman. I could talk all day with this conferee, but I best allow others the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Carmichael. You was very professional this time. Representative Keither.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chuck, I really appreciate you coming in and giving this report. It takes me back to days when Carl Holmes was chair and we would have these kinds of things all the time. I appreciate what you have brought to the table. I have a question. Are you going to make this presentation to the Senate Utilities Committee?
I am, yes, this afternoon.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. I really don't have any questions. I really want to commend you on coming in and walking us through what happened. I fortunately was a member of KEDA and connected with SPP on a regular basis, so it really helps maybe some others to understand exactly how this all got processed. And I pretty much understood it from the get-go, but I'm glad it's behind us and don't look forward to another one. But thank you for your presentation. It was very helpful. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Keither. Representative Berkowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two simple questions, I guess. Number one, during this crisis and going up to this crisis, was Wolf Creek running at its normal capacity? And number two, how long does it take if Wolf Creek is not running at capacity for it to be able to ramp up?
So those are great questions. Wolf Creek was a gem in this particular event. It ran flat out, pedal to the metal the whole way through. At one time, there were some mechanical issues as a result of cold that looked like it could threaten its performance, and the team out there dealt with it and managed through it brilliantly. They essentially had a 20-hour window, I believe, about a 20-hour window to resolve an issue where they'd have to start taking it offline. And I think they got it done in 2 or 3 hours. That is a ton of power in one place. And unlike other facilities, the fuel is already there. So it was a very important asset to have. Look, when you build those things, there's all sorts of concerns. They're extremely expensive to build and relatively these days expensive to maintain. But boy, on hot summer days and an event like that, they are just absolutely invaluable. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else? Representative Del Perdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just actually a couple of questions here. Earlier on, you used the analogy of with Texas, the providers down there don't necessarily generate, whereas up here it's kind of the buck stops here. But where we are plugging into the Southwest Power Pool, you don't own the whole 17-state area, so isn't it essentially the same scenario up here?
Yeah, I'd say that's a great question. I'd say there's a difference, which is you've still got in Texas an authority that manages the grid. It's called ERCOT, and it could tell any of those utilities to reduce consumption. But the problem is when something goes wrong and you're trying to bring it back up, you've got the grid to operate and you've got the generation to operate, and those are two distinct things. Here, when there's an issue, we don't have anybody to point to. Now, we were told by the Southwest Power Pool to reduce load, and that absolutely, we could point the finger at them, and technically we're required to do what they tell us to do. Having said that, though, if we got to a situation where, we were trying to respond like they were in Texas, there's all sorts of finger pointing amongst the utilities because there's maybe 6, 7, 8 generating utilities selling into a market that have to meet that aggregate demand, and they're all pointing fingers at each other. Here, again, if there's not enough power to meet demand, if there's a trouble on the system, everybody knows who it is. Just like we can't avoid responsibility when SPP says to shed load. Ultimately, just like taxes, we're the collector, right? We're the ones who are responsible. And so I don't think most of our customers really care that Southwest Power Pool called this. This is an outage from Evergy and our performance in it. You know, how we call it, when we call it, what the communication's like, that's all entirely on us, where it's very disaggregated in Texas.
Then second question with, in Mr. Berquist over here kind of alluded to it also with getting into Wolf Creek, but is there any information for what amount of power was being generated here in Kansas or by Evergy versus what was being shipped out of state?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So we ship so the Southwest Power Pool is like a bathtub with multiple faucets, right? So you've got an OG&E faucet, you've got an AEP faucet, you've got an Excel faucet, you've got an Evergy faucet. We all make electricity, or in this case, water, and we dump it into the tub. Once it goes into the tub, how can you tell where the water comes from? Because it's dispatched and it's run and it's used as a whole big pool. Having said that, the easiest way to answer your question is we know what our demand was in our service territory, how much our customers were using, and we know how much we were putting into the pool, and the amount that we put into the pool exceeded what we were using.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Say the topic of resilience was kind of teed up, and you spoke to it in your presentation. You talked about coal having frozen coal piles, which happens in a normal winter. I think that's a fairly expected thing. And then Mr. Representative Berquist asked about Wolf Creek, and you said that performed as a gem. So it seems in terms of resiliency, I've heard good reports about the nuclear plant and about coal. What about the other end of the spectrum? What proved least resilient, and what lessons learned on that side?
Great questions. The first way I would answer your question is to say our customers, and I think the Southwest Power Pool generally benefited from having a relatively diverse portfolio of power, meaning it comes from renewables, it comes from natural gas, it comes from coal, and it comes from nuclear. I mean, the first thing is, look, electromechanical things, anything that moves has problems in the cold, but since the fuel is all on site, and once a nuclear plant loads up, it runs for a year and a half. I mean, look, that plant was wonderful. I think if it weren't for the startup costs and the maintenance costs the way they exist today, and even Bill Gates recently, and you know, he's come out with a new climate book and is looking at it, but Bill Gates has said part of the solution is going to have to be nuclear. I don't know if we're 5 years away from that. More likely, we're going to see increased build out of natural gas, increased build out of renewables, because they're lower cost upfront and lower cost fuel situations right now. But I think long term, to avoid things like this, hopefully we get back to a point where nuclear power is affordable to put up and to run again. Look, we experience probably the most problems getting natural gas. Principally because there's two big natural gas pipelines and they were maxed out, Southern Star and the Panhandle. And because on a normal basis, most of our plants run, it's either wind, coal, or nuclear. A lot of those plants don't have firm transmission for natural gas, nor would you want us to pay for that on a normal basis. So natural gas and getting the fuel to run those was difficult. And then look, we've got a lot of wind on the system, and it performed at about 50% through this of what our capacity is. 50% of what was normal or what we would expect. So that was definitely an issue. Now, it's not fair to say that wind caused this. Wind didn't cause this. And I would argue that one of the benefits, again, is a diverse portfolio that has all of those things. But certainly the Southwest Power Pool in Texas were impacted by wind, and certainly natural gas and its availability is a big issue, which is, you know, when I've testified in front of this committee in past years, and maybe, I can't remember if it did this year on this topic, and certainly in front of the Senate, one of the things I've said is, you know, people like to poke at Evergy for retrofitting coal plants low in price. We get poked on that all the time. And I say, listen, I understand that natural gas is less costly right now, normally. I understand that we are now the largest producer of natural gas in the world, but storage and transmission has not kept up with that. And what happens when you can't store it or deliver it is you have huge price spikes, just like we have seen. And so there's an infrastructure question there. But in this particular case, Evergy benefited from having a significant amount of capacity in coal that they could call on during this event.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a quick comment, Jack, I just want to echo other earlier comments, how much we appreciate you coming in today and explaining what went right and, of course, what went wrong, too. That candid assessment of that whole event is appreciated. I think that helps us in the future when we're looking at resilience issues or other issues related to emergencies. But I appreciate the update and all the details you provided. So thank you.
You were probably happy to be a representative and not over here explaining to representatives what was going on.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I got a few. I'd like to follow up on some of the questions that were asked.
Yes, sir.
When you had stated that even though we had our demand, we knew what our demand was, we were still generating enough electricity to cover our demand, but we were sending it out of state to somebody else. And I guess that's okay. That's a question I think a lot of people ask. Did we run out of electricity or did we help other states to keep their balance load? And were they being put on hold too, the same way what you said, the 650 megawatts that were generated out of the 14 states?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, we weren't sending our power out of state. We just dump it into a big pool and then everybody draws from that pool. We make it here, so the shortest path is here, so it's probably 98% of our electricity made here, it probably stayed here. But no, this is a list of all the utilities that had to, electric utilities that had to reduce power. They go across 14 states, and there's about 20 of them here. Evergy's share of that total was right around 18%, a little less, a little more. We're still settling that out with the Southwest Power Pool. But no, again, when we called temporary emergency power outages, it was not because we did not have enough electricity generated here. We were putting more into the pool right here than we were taking out. So it was not a lack of generation. That's not the case in other areas of the Southwest Power Pool.
Okay, that's a good answer. Representative Smith. Did you have a question?
Chuck, you're still muted.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you hear me now? Am I okay? Hey, Chuck, what I was wondering, a couple of years ago in Pittsburgh, Kansas, Pittsburgh was thinking about leaving Evergy and going off on their own. What effect would that have had during this crisis?
Well, it's a little hard to say, honestly, because in our experience, a lot of municipal utilities probably are going to have a larger cost impact as a result of this than Evergy is going to. But it's hard to know. It's really on a municipal utility by municipal utility perspective. If they were not part of the Southwest Power Pool, it's entirely possible that they could have avoided temporary power outages should that have been necessary of the Southwest Power Pool. But it's just really hard to say. We have some municipal utilities that are part of the Southwest Power Pool, and then there's 4 or 5 different ways that municipal utilities resource their electricity. Many of them get it through us. Many of it get it through associations that also get a part of their electricity from us. But there are many municipal utilities out there, not just in Kansas, but across the Southwest Power Pool region that are going to be dealing with probably higher prices than most of the municipalities served by us will be. Having said that, you know, we love Pittsburgh, and we're glad that that's been shelved for a while, and we'll continue to do everything we can to make sure that Pittsburgh sees the value in that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I was going to ask also, I don't know if any of the other members would like to have a copy of those generation lists, but I'd like to see a copy of that if you could get me one, if you don't mind. Representative Delperdang.
Myself as well, Mr. Chair. That's a good idea. Thank you.
Will do.
Just, would you give Barbara a digital copy and then she can send it out to everybody?
I'll give the entire Southwest Power Pool deck. They put a deck going through exactly what happened and when, and a whole bunch of other information, and I'll get that to the committee so you can review it. If you have questions, let me know.
Representative Del.
Let me jump in here again. Educate me a little bit on the smart meters. Let's assume you take the KCC and the regulation of the retail out of here. Would the smart meter be able to tell precisely what I was using during that crisis time, or is it just an average over 30 days or whatever the billing period is?
No, a smart meter will relay to us what you're using in a real-time basis, not completely real-time. I think it might be in 6-minute or 6-second intervals. Forgive me, I don't know what the specifics are, but we get a lot of interval data over the day about the electrical usage. We have not looked at that. We're not checking up on customers to make sure they can serve during this time period. What you use, you know, in an event like this is your business. And frankly, I got into a knockdown, drag out fight with my wife about how much to conserve. For those of you who don't know, I had COVID during all of this. And so she was under the assertion that because I had COVID, we couldn't go below a certain threshold in the house. But no, we're not checking up on customers retroactively. But yes, we do get that information on an interval basis.
And this is not your company, but would you know, is it similar on the gas company side?
You know, I don't want to speak for the gas companies. I'm not sure how much automated metering in different areas of Kansas exist and what interval they would get it on. Probably better to let them talk to that. But I imagine where there's AMI, it's probably a similar situation, but what the intervals are, I wouldn't know.
Thank you.
Follow-up question for the smart meter. Are you able to shut down certain meters in a certain area and keep certain meters on if it was like elderly people or people that are on life support or whatever? Is that the purpose? I remember when we talked about the smart meter years ago, they were going to be able to control them from some central point and keep people in service and others that are not as necessarily required. Is that a true statement or not?
So it depends on where you are in our service territory, whether there is automatic turn on or turn off. In general, in the Evergy, Kansas Central, or the old legacy service territory, or Westar service territory, there is automated meters, meaning you can turn them on remotely and off remotely. However, in this situation, that wouldn't work. And the reason for that is because we call outages at a circuit level. So think about it this way. You've got a family room, right? And probably your family room, maybe your kitchen are on one circuit in your house. And if that was our grid and we said you need to reduce load, you might go to the circuit breaker and turn off the circuit breaker to the kitchen and to the one circuit breaker to the kitchen and to the family room, right? But we can't keep on the two outlets that have the TV and the cable box associated with it. If we turn off that circuit, it takes everything down in those two rooms. So even if we had the ability to turn on or turn off in that area, we've taken down the entire circuit. Now, in this particular case, if there was a hospital in the kitchen, right, then the family room and kitchen circuit might not have been called, and we called 2 or 3 bedrooms instead. But that's the easiest way to kind of think about it at a what we're all familiar with level.
I think that's a pretty good explanation, especially with people trying to generate their own electricity in their house and find out their generator won't run the bedroom or the kitchen at the same time, or the coffee pot when you kick it on. Thank you, Representative Schreiber. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on Representative Delperdang's question, during the crises days, believe it or not, we tried not to run the dryer, and we didn't cook a roast in the oven. We used the microwave. We did the things, hopefully, that we were supposed to do. But on a 30-day billing cycle, I'm not sure what happened on the following Wednesday or Thursday when all that laundry got done and we increased our load. Is that going to be billed eventually as at the same rate as the 3 or 4 days of crisis? I mean, theoretically, we could go back and look at my meter data and know how much I consumed in those days when the cost of energy was high and adjust the rate. Or is this going to end up averaged over the entire rate base? Do you have any prediction as to how that might happen? Because to the extent that there is price elasticity in utilities, this would be an example of where it might apply, that it'd be a darn good reason not to charge my car and not to run my dryer on high demand days like these. Can you help me with those concepts?
Absolutely. There's a lot of really good stuff there. So first of all, if you were in Texas and you conserved on Monday or Tuesday, but then started to use more on Wednesday, there would likely be a significant price differential. Because you're here in a regulated utility, and unless you're on a different rate structure that most people are on some time of use rates or something like that, then no, there won't be a difference between the Tuesday, the Monday, and the Wednesday usage. That's why we ask people to voluntarily curtail their usage or reduce their usage and conserve. You'll get the kilowatt hour savings of not using that electricity when you conserved, but overall, there's no price differential day to day. I do think that one of the things that you will see in the future is the ability for people to, not just in a storm situation, but to have price differentials based on when they are using electricity and the cost relative at that time period. That is something that technology will enable, and that is something I think over the next 5 to 10 years, probably 5 years, you will see some people opt into, just on a normal basis. The easiest way to think about that, or a pilot that could happen for something like that, is electric vehicle charging. In the summertime, when there's a drop in temperature that's rather significant on the prairie, we get high winds in Kansas, and those high winds make our windmills go, but it just happens to be overnight. There's not a lot of people using electricity. The price of electricity at that time period is very, very, very small, and in some cases actually goes negative. It would actually be helpful to have people charge their car then. So I can see those types of rates as a first effort where people could say, you're on an electric vehicle charging rate, which means if you charge your electric vehicle at night, in some cases you might even get paid to charge. But I think broadening that out to the house as technology and automation in the house continues to deploy, I think you're going to start to see those rates in the state of Kansas and others.
Well, I'll tell you what, I charge my car between 11 at night and 4 in the morning, but I'm not expecting a check back from Evergy right now.
Not yet anyway.
Any other questions? Well, this one's kind of directed at Representative Carmichael. If you ever had a generator, I'll tell you what, your microwave will talk to the generator a lot harder than the oven will for 220. That's what really surprises me. If you've ever ran a generator because you need it to, the 220 doesn't take near the power of 110, like your coffee pot or
But
your
it's over a
microwave.
much shorter period of time, so the total consumption is less with the microwave than it is with the oven. And because of Westar's good warnings, I did get my standby generator out and I fired it up and made sure it worked, and then I didn't get curtailed. So ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure.
There you go. It's interesting. You learn a lot when you have to generate your own. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Casely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, and also lobbyists in the gallery or whatever you want to call it back there, this seating. If anybody would like to come back to committee again and also explain anything with natural gas or wind in the future, if we have some time, it'd be welcome you to come and give your side or how your areas fared during that time period too. So the committee has a broad experience of what everybody's doing in participation. So with that, keep in mind and get with Barbara if you'd like to do that. And if you don't, that's fine with me also. With that, I don't see any other things for the committee. Next week, we have a bill to work, so we'll be, or looking and hearing, so we'll be working on that. So we are adjourned.